The Catholic Church has dealt with accusations of sexual abuse for decades. Now, this crisis has escalated in recent months. Earlier this month, Pope Francis publicly acknowledged that sexual abuse by nuns and Catholic priests and bishops. Just last week, a former Cardinal Maggiore was defrocked by the Pope for sexual abuse allegations. This Sunday concluded a 4-day summit on the sexual abuse crisis. Talking Points Analyst Sabrina Maggiore is here with more on the scandal. Sabrina, thanks so much for joining us now. This has been going on for decades, but what led up to this historic summit?
So really what led up to this was a series of investigations have come out that really shed light on how big this crisis is, and it really is a global crisis. One investigation that I want to take a look at is a 4-year investigation in Australia, which found that over 4,000 people were abused at more than 1,000 Catholic institutions between 1980 and 2015. And we actually just heard that the Australian Cardinal was found guilty of sex abuse charges, and he was one of the most senior officials to be found guilty of this to date. In Germany, the German Catholic Church concluded at least 3,500 people were abused by the church between 1946 and 2014. And in Ireland, 4 reports published since 2005 detail tens of thousands of children suffering wide-ranging abuse in church-run work-style institutions. Moving to Chile, Chilean criminal prosecutors have opened more than 100 investigations into abusive priests in just recent months. And then back home in the U.S., 70 dioceses and religious orders have released a list of accused priests. Here in Syracuse in December, Syracuse released the name of 57 priests implicated in sex abuse of minors dating back to the 1950s. None of them are actively serving, but all of this collectively really led to the Pope calling the summit.
So, looking at all of these allegations, looking at the severity of this issue, what was actually discussed at this summit? So, the summit really was scheduled around 4 days, and there were 190 church leaders at the summit. 3 speakers spoke at the summit. One was a Nigerian nun named Victoria Abanibo, and she had some pretty harsh criticisms of the church. She really condemned the practice of letting priests who abuse children retire with their pensions intact. And we have sound from that. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
The first step towards true transparency is to admit wrongdoing and then to publish what has been done. I repeat, we publish what has been done.
So obviously she's calling for transparency. There was also Cardinal Reinhard Marx, a Munich cardinal. He also had some pretty strong remarks and some serious allegations that came out of that. So let's take a listen to what he had to say as well.
Of course.
Files that could have documented the terrible deeds and named those responsible were destroyed or not even created. The stipulated procedures and processes for the prosecution of offenses were deliberately not complied with, but instead cancelled or overridden.
So that's obviously some pretty shocking comments coming out of that. Serious impacts on the Catholic Church as well.
We see victims of the abuse are saying that this summit didn't go far enough. So what came out of the summit that they're saying this, and what's the reason for their criticism?
So after the summit, Pope Francis has called for a couple things. He very strongly denounced these crimes, and he called for the creation of a task force that will address this. He called for the creation of a guidebook that should be coming out soon that will tell bishops how to deal with this in their ranks. But the biggest criticism has really been the fact that he didn't mention the zero tolerance policy, and that's something that protesters have been calling for quite a while now, and victims of clergy abuse have been calling for. And what this zero tolerance policy would do is that anytime that there is sort of a sexual misconduct allegation that's credible, or if there's any proof of a cover-up, these clergy officials will be immediately dismissed from the clergy, and that's not something that we saw happening, unfortunately.
So could you go a little bit more depth into some of those criticisms about this kind of zero tolerance policy? Why do you think, or has the Catholic Church said why maybe they haven't been very vocal about maybe saying that part of it?
So there was no mention of this zero tolerance policy in either the comments that came from the priests during the summit or in the 21 points that Pope Francis issued following the summit. But in addition to this, one big criticism is that really Pope Francis, in his final remarks, said something along the lines of that this is something that happens everywhere, and victims of the clergy abuse are saying that this was something that shouldn't have been brought up in the first place. He did say that this is something that is particularly immoral when it happens in the Catholic Church, but again, complaints that this happened and this was brought up at all.
Definitely an institutional failing and something that we're going to keep an eye on moving forward.